The sea began his story, and the sea never ceased to remind him of what had been taken, rolling its iron-gray shoulders beneath a sky of flint as gulls cried like ghosts over the black ramparts of Storm's End. On a cliff where the wind was always sharpening itself upon the stones, a boy learned that grief did not come as a weeping storm but as a steady tide, patient, unending, wearing the shore into something simpler and more severe. The ship had gone down in sight of the walls. Breakers lifted it, dashed it, lifted it again until timbers and hopes were scattered into foam, and on the battlements 3 brothers watched the last white of the sails vanish, each absorbing the lesson differently. The eldest raised his chin to the salt and swore to wrestle the world into laughter and crown. The youngest found warmth in the hearth and years later, in crowds that bloomed like spring around his smile. And the middle boy, narrow-shouldered and silent-eyed, took the sea into himself the way a blade takes a whetstone, without complaint and hardening by degrees. He did not arrive to his nature as a thunderclap but as a season, narrowing into convictions that could withstand hunger and the half-light of gray days. Duty came to him not as a slogan but as a stubborn companion. He counted, and remembered, and endured. Where the eldest wore victory like a cloak, he wore endurance like armor, a faith made of ledgers and oaths rather than songs. Even as a youth he had a way of standing that made others want to fidget, as if they had arrived late to a reckoning he had been carrying in his bones since the night the ship went down. When the realm erupted into rebellion and banners spilled like rivers of color across the countryside, Storm's End stood in siege under pudgy roses and polite arrogance. All around the walls the enemies settled to wait, their music and feasts drifting on the wind like a taunt. Within there was counting. Counting of sacks and barrels, counting of measures of grain, counting of candles to know how long the nights might be endured. The boy had become a young man by then, and hunger had a face and a smell and a habit of sharpening everything. He grew narrower, harder, his temper reduced to a pilot light the wind could not quite catch. There were mutters, always. He met them with the same unblinking gaze he would later turn upon lords and kings and gods. One night, when the sea felt as close as a whispered secret at the foot of the cliffs, a small boat found a wrinkle of darkness between patrols and slid into a postern world of rock and tide pools. The man who guided it had the sea in his hands and the stink of salt and tar in his clothes, a smuggler with quick eyes and a battered sense of decent wickedness. He brought onions and the taste of mercy, and for the first time in months the kitchens filled not with silence but with the sound of knives meeting good work and laughter loosening under soot-black rafters. Stomachs remembered what it felt like to be lined. Faces softened. The young captain of the castle's stubbornness allowed himself one breath that did not howl. When the sieges broke and the world changed its face, he called the smuggler before him. Men expected warmth. What they received was the particular justice of a man who could not bear a balance left uneven. He made the smuggler a knight, and he took the first joint of each finger on his left hand for the years of unlawful prowling at night. The new knight went away with a name the world would never quite clean, with rings chopped away and a lord's gratitude sitting on his shoulders beside a pain that would wake him in winter for the rest of his life. Neither man ever thought the act cruel. Between them stood a sense of accounts kept square. Thus did the middle brother come into his adulthood, a tallyman of harsh mercies, a keeper of walls against the long, grinding press of other men's appetites. He watched the eldest swirl through war as if battle were a dance with drums, watched him take the throne with a laugh that shook banners, watched the realm fall in love with the storm in his blood. When the dust settled and the tired king began to measure himself against feasts and hunts and memories of glory, the middle brother received a keep that was not the one expected. Storm's End, with its sevenfold thick walls and the taste of brine in its stones, passed to the youngest, whose pretty smile and open hands collected admirers like blossoms. To the middle brother fell Dragonstone, black, bony, volcanic, smelling of old fires and colder sorceries, a place where gulls circled like envoys to unkind skies. He took it with the same expression with which he took everything else, a long exhale that acknowledged both the slight and the duty, and then a fixed gaze on the work that followed. Where the king wanted men who could drink him into good humor, he retained his stern sibling because ships cannot be bullied into obedience by laughter. As master of ships, he built hulls that cut rough water without complaint. He measured drafts in harbors and currents, roped the realms smuggling into knots, taught the navy to line itself not for looks but for leverage. He stacked casks of pitch and timber and ore and crew not in songs but in tallies. There were few smiles in his service, but there were fewer mistakes. He kept Dragonstone as a man keeps a ledger. Read and reread, updated each evening as the light thinned and the gulls went pale against the last gold above a black horizon. Marriage came to him as another entry, and yet not. His lady wore her piety the way he wore his habit of severity, so that the two of them in a room made others stand straighter without knowing why. There was a daughter with a face like pale dawn and a faded stain upon one cheek, a brush of old sickness that had not killed her but had marked her as if winter had touched her once and then spared her. He loved her in that struggling way the stern love and youthing firmly, and at odd moments with a tenderness that struck him like an ambush and made him look away until it passed. He told himself that duty and love were not enemies, and tried to treat them as though they were the same cloth. The world shrugged again, as it always does, with the death of a good man who had been the mind of the throne. Poison wandered like mist through halls. A king died in a convenient hunting story, and beneath the feasts and mourning, the middle brother counted again. He remembered hair colors and lineages. He thought about the way truth smells when it is close but still hidden. What he found tasted of iron and danger, and it drove him out across the water to his black island before the city could swallow him. He did not shout his findings from the walls. He wrote, he sent, he waited. When the Stag King died with a joke under his tongue and antlers laid on a coffin, the middle brother threw off patience and declared what he believed the numbers demanded, which was that the crown belonged not to a pretty boy with his mother's eyes, but to the man who came next in pure line, the man who never asked to be liked. He raised his banners on the Black Island under a sky that looked as if it had been burned and not repaired. It was then that the Red Woman came fully into his life, a priestess whose voice had the low warmth of a hearth that has never felt snow. She brought fire not as comfort but as will, a flame that insisted, that interpreted, that spoke in iron frames rather than incense. He was not a man to kneel easily, least of all to rumor or miracle. Yet he watched the Red Woman's shadows and saw too much in the way her fire read men, in the way iron heated and bent, in the way fear in his garrison took on the shape of reverence. He was a practical man, and practical men know that belief is a tool as surely as chain and anchor. On a night of smoky damp, he stood before the ancient hollowness of Dragonstone's great courtyard and allowed the old river of the realm's faith to be turned. Carved figures, gentle with centuries of petitioners' fingers, took the torch and became a memory of light before they were cinders. The Red Woman spoke of a prince that was promised and a sword that would drink light. The blade he drew from fire shone for a moment, then cooled into an honest steel that had never tasted sunrise. Some smirked, some doubted, some trembled. He set his jaw and pretended to feel what others said they saw. If the gods chose to manifest in half-truths and elaborate hints, he would do as he always had, add them to the ledger and look for what could be used. He sent ravens and envoys and the flint of his will across the peninsula toward the smiling army of his youngest brother, who wore a cloak of green spring and rode beneath banners that broke hearts. They met between camps under a sky of polite blue. The younger spoke as if the future were a feast saved for him and for all who admired him. The elder's stern mouth did not soften. He offered not friendship but order. Bend the knee, set aside vanity, let the numbers tell the tale. He was answered with laughter and smiles shaped like knives. He returned to his camp with the calm walk of a man who has accepted the shape of the argument, one which would be decided not by words but by night. How the next piece of history slipped under the tent flaps is something the world still whispers about, and perhaps the night itself keeps one secret in a room without windows. A light went out in the green camp, and with it a life that had been so bright the world had mistaken glow for law. Men woke to grief and to confusion. The middle brother found his stables filling with horses and his lists filling with names that had sworn to a vision more handsome, but now tugged their caps toward a duty more difficult. He accepted them with neither smile nor gloat, feeling only the familiar cool of responsibility deepen like shade at noon. Storm's End opened at last, its stout lord falling to the sort of midnight that leaves no footprints. Inside waited a boy with the king's chin and the wrong mother, and the middle brother took him into his keeping with a care that looked like calculation but tasted like protection. Outsiders always misunderstood the shape of his feelings, because he never let them reach his face. He wanted justice measured to the ounce, and for that boy to breathe long enough to have an honest life somewhere the Red Woman's I could not find him. When his new hand, the same smuggler he had knighted and maimed, came muttering about smoke and daggers, he listened. One by one he stacked his burdens, and none slipped. The black ships gathered, their sails a flock under cloud. He came down the river that warmed the capital with oars dipping together, with rams like clenched teeth, with a patience that had been calculating currents for a lifetime. He expected to be met by iron and scorn and the peculiar cowardice of those who love their privileges more than the people they sit above. He did not expect the river to gnash with green flame like a beast loosed from an alchemist's demi. The city's defenders, too clever by half, drew a chain across the water and trapped his fleet inside a cauldron of bright ruin. Fire made a sound like wet silk tearing. Men, reduced to the size of their last moment, leapt into heat or river with the same result. His ships perished by the dozen. A son of the smuggler went down somewhere in that glowing trap, and the grief lodged in his father like a chunk of glass he would never cough up, however many winters he outlived. On the banks, under the walls, the claimant fought as a soldier rather than a symbol, while the city that had mocked him found its courage sharpened by the arrival of a fresh host. Horses thundered with pretty plumes and brighter armor. The stag's line broke, and in the end he was pulled from that place by the hands of men who loved him with the hard, flat love that turned into action without flourishes. Dragonstone received him again with the sullen welcome of an old wound. He walked its halls like a man who had seen the arithmetic go mad. He was not defeated in the way of youths, no tantrum, no self-pity, no throwing of cups at the hearth. But he was less, as if the sea had eroded one more rib of cliff from beneath him. In such hours men of sense branch one way or another. Some become gentler, some go strange, some find the quiet kind of courage that looks like humility. He paced the basilisk corridors of his black keep and counted. The Red Priestess came and went like a banked coal. The old maester, whose hands trembled when the wind came up, tried to poison the flame and swallowed more than he meant. He died with apology still shaping his lips. The smuggler, nursing a private pain, sought the priestess with a knife in his heart and failed. For it is difficult to kill those who have made themselves here in more than one sense. For this he was put in a cell to consider the measurable distances between loyalty and murder. But darkness, properly attended, lets a man hear new drums beneath the beat of despair. From the far north came a letter in the spare, bleak hand of a brotherhood vowed to water rather than wine. It spoke of enemies that do not negotiate, whose breath falls like frost on words until they shatter. The smuggler read it in his cell, and something inside him flared that even the loss of a son could not dim. He carried the words up out of the cold and laid them before his king with the same stern humility he had brought onions through surf. And the claimant, who had lost a battle with green fire and the world's laughter, looked at an old wall and the specter of a foe who did not care about claims or blood or joy, and he straightened. There are judgments only certain men can make in certain seasons. He decided, as he had done in siege, that arithmetic must trump appetite, and that the realm needed him most where there were least songs to sing. The ships moved north through seas that bit and smelled of iron and snow. They came to a wall so tall it made even his pride look small, and there the would-be king became what he had always secretly been, a keeper. From out of the woods and the white came a storm of free folk and stubborn men, and his banners broke their charge in a fury of cold steel. The wall breathed easier. The Black brothers, brittle and brave, looked up and found a kindred severity looking back. He was stingy with his thanks and generous with his protection, and men respected him in the way granite is respected. Not loved, but leaned upon when the wind starts cutting. He spoke with the boy who led the watchers, in fact if not in cheer, a lad with thick hair and the sort of somberness that only makes sense to those who have seen too much too young. The older man offered destiny in a neat package with a title and a place full of wolves and memories. The boy refused with a politeness that both irritated and impressed. There is a kind of man who becomes softer when crossed, but this one was hard in the particular manner that allowed him to bend a plan without losing its straight edge. Where Jon Snow would not, the older man sought other angles. If one door shuts, count and hammer. Somewhere the beam will give. He moved among cold houses, mountain clans, and old resentments and offered the North something they could smell. Protection without flattery, justice without smiles. He was not kissed by firelight in those halls. He made no grand toasts. He took back a stronghold deep among pines where raiders once hung their salt-dried trophies. He returned it to a family that had dreamt of it through long winters. Little girls with hard eyes said they knew no king but one, and though all knew their meaning, some chose to hear the echo of what he claimed. With the clansmen he spoke like stones speak to stones, without grace, but with a gravity that pulled them closer. They respected his unbending simply because winter respects nothing else. Yet the cold has a way of testing mathematics. The path to his enemy's strong seat inverted from road to trap, from plan to struggle. Snow came like a slow and endless army, erasing paths and making supplies a story ambitious men told over dwindling cook fires. Treachery sniffed at the edges of his camp, old grudges torqued into new betrayals by frostbitten hungers and the way loyalty thins when bread does. He cut a traitor with his own hand and felt only calmer for it. He marched and did not arrive, in a half-forgotten village of battered willows and a frozen pond. He set his men like pegs against a tightening world and waited, counting the days, the arrows, the fires, the patience left in faces. The smuggler went away on errands of faith and danger, hunting a lost boy the North would rally to, taking under his arm the hope that the ledger might yet balance if only one column received the right name. In stories told around hearths far from where the snow squealed under desperate boots, a fork arrives at this point, and the singer chooses softly which stream to follow. In one telling, the cold did not merely test him. It undid him. The snow swallowed wagons, men swapped faces with death in the night, and a father's love, which had always walked quietly behind a march of duty, stumbled and fell into fire in a choice that the world could not forgive. Under those winds, the man who had kept so many ledgers found nothing left to spend, and he spent himself. He was found beneath trees that had learned to stand straight by studying him, and a sword born of a vow cut him free from all accounts. The snow took his last breath and kept it. Another telling rides a different wolf track through the drifts, where he lures proud men onto a frozen lake and teaches them that ice has its own arithmetic. The enemy crashes in bright gear into the deep, banners swallowed like weeds beneath glass. Prisoners mumble and bleed from split lips, and the claimant writes letters on rough wood with ink that freezes between lines. In that chronicle he stands yet, thin as ever, stubborn as a black nail driven into winter until winter itself has no choice but to bend or break. In those nights the wind at the crofters' village recites his stubborn creed, while the field bellies of freemen and proud lords alike complain in the same language. He wakes to ice in his beard and a ledger that refuses to settle. The truth, unbothered by our hunger for clarity, often threads both tales, as the northern lights thread green through a colorless sky. What is beyond doubt is the shape of the man beneath those skies, a figure cut from the same bleak honesty as naked trees on a ridge. He did not so much lead as insist. Where others mistook kindness for justice or victory for destiny, he kept the count of what men owe to their own oaths. His sigil changed to a stag flamed inside a heart, but the heart was not romance. It was a brand of insistence, a reminder that some men make a furnace of their will and feed it anything brought near. He allowed the Red Woman to call him chosen, but when she was not looking he inspected the blade of that word and asked it to prove itself against the only whetstone he trusted, the hard edge of need. The smuggler prowled through cities of stone and snow alike, bargaining with men who hid their wisdom beneath plates of pastry and courtesies rich as meat. He carried his lord's thin hope in each palm like an ember cupped against wind. He sent ravens bannered with quiet conspiracy in the small hours. He spoke the old names in rooms where the new ones were poison. Beneath all this, the claimant's daughter laughed softly, practiced her letters with patient care, and fed a little cat with a hand that had known pity and fear before it knew anything else. On particular nights, he would set aside quill and map and stand in her doorway simply to ensure that light fell where it ought, and that his ledger was not so cold that it forgot the living coin of a child's breath. But winter is greedy. It comes not with one demand but with many, and it is indifferent to our categories of sacrifice. There are stories in which he placed a kindling he could not bear to hold into a flame that promised victory and gave him only ash. In some of them, even the Red Woman flinched to see the market he entered to pay for his claim. Those stories end with a silence so heavy that even his stern shoulders could not bear it, and the army, seeing the man shrink within his armor, fell apart before the frost breathed again. Other stories postpone that grief and instead describe a thin victory curled inside multiple losses, like a coin at the bottom of a jar of brine. More trouble to retrieve than it is worth, but still retrieved by a man who cannot bear to leave any count unsettled. And always, in all versions, the wind off the sea finds him again. It brings the taste of salt and the iron smell of black stone. Somewhere in it, a memory of onions and gratitude curls up like smoke in a forgotten hallway. He is not a forgiving man, but he knows the weight of debts that cannot be paid, and that knowledge makes him precise in a world that prefers theatrics to exactness. In halls warmed by other kings' humor, he would always have been called severe. In halls struggling against enemies that do not smile, his severity is a gift as plain as a warm cloak. Men who served him used small words for him, hard, fair, iron, because around him their tongues could not find the longer ones, and besides, such words fit the winter they lived in. He punished where he had promised he would punish. He promoted men who did not flatter him. He rewarded loyalty not with expensive sweetness but with a safety that, once you had felt it, you never mistook for anything else. Even his prejudices had the cold cleanness of honesty. If you failed him, he did not pretend to forget. It is said that in his sleep he sees not thrones but walls, and not crowns but lamps kept filled against long nights. Some of the world claimed him because of birth. He claimed himself because of arithmetic. Somewhere, perhaps, there is a book with many columns and his name at the top of each page. Not the name of a prince or a darling, but the name of a keeper, written in the plain hand of a man who taught himself to draw letters neatly because to do less would be to let the figures wobble. When you listen long enough to the tale, the fire shifts, and you come to understand that the drama of banners and declarations is only ever the skin on the milk. Beneath is the slow scald, field after field sown in frost, children looking at doors that do not open, mothers looking at paths that do not return fathers. Beneath is the nature of endurance, and how seldom it is loved. He was born to a house that learned early to ride storms rather than flee them, and perhaps that is why his face grew into its lines so oddly, so early, as if winter had drawn them with a stylus. Where others are taught patience by bards, he was taught by hunger, counting, and the silence between words when men are deciding if they will do what they said. So the story becomes not only one of swords and rivers set alight with green sorcery, of tents that collapse in midnight and castles that open to the smell of smoke, but also of a man's interior craft, the way he built a hearth from obligations and sat beside it with a soul that did not thaw easily. If you have ever seen an old tree in winter holding its shape after a storm, its bark flayed in places and its crown reduced to stubborn gesture against gray, you know something of him. That tree does not ask for applause. It asks only to be allowed the honesty of its form. If his end came under a beech with winter clatter above, it was not an end that undid the remains of his character. If instead his end has not yet arrived in some chronicles, if he still stands somewhere the wind rips at sea, Anvis and the horses champ at ice, then he is as he has always been. Lean, counting, restless in all the ways a cliff is restless. Appearing still but constantly giving bits of himself to the elements because that is what standing requires. In either case, the man and his measure survive in the rhythm he taught those around him. Do the thing that the count demands, however you feel, and leave the feeling for other men whose work is to be adored. The smuggler will always sit a little closer to the fire when he thinks of him. He will rub the shortened fingers against one another during long talks and remember a starless night and a skiff bumping a secret landing, and a young commander whose gratitude was so bare you could see its ribs. If you ask the smuggler what it amounted to, all those lists and long marches and hard words, he will not speak for a time. He will look at the tide under the moon. Then he might say that without such men the world does not survive its pretty princes and smiling lords, and that someone must choose the work that does not earn songs because otherwise the songs grow too sweet to bear weight. In rooms where tapestries catch the orange light and the logs crackle down to embers, the tale of the middle brother softens at the edges. His sternness becomes the quiet of snowfall rather than its bite. His punishments become the woodworking of order rather than the lash. You see him as he sometimes was when nobody watched. A man pausing outside a door to listen to his daughter's soft speech to a cat. A man standing on a balcony to breathe the iron breath of the sea. A man who could not quite pray but who believed that if anything holy existed it would reveal itself in the sound of hundreds of boots falling in step toward the right work. And so the sea that began his story continues to write its always letter against the land. The gulls still turn white, then gray, then vanish. Somewhere a lordling hears the tale and thinks it severe, and somewhere a farmer hears it and thinks it sensible, and each is right according to his need. Somewhere a girl with ink-stained fingers and a cheek the color of an old bruise copies the words, "Keep your word," again and again until the page looks like snowfall and the ink like seeds scattered for spring. Somewhere the red woman watches the coals and sees a shape that might be him, or might be only the trick every fire plays upon every watcher. What remains when the fire burns down, when the listener's eyes grow heavy and the night presses its cool palm upon the brow, is the shape of a man like a lighthouse, unloved by sailors when the waters are soft and the moon is thin and friendly, revered in their way when the fog comes like wool and the rocks wait with patient, fatal teeth. He was a tower built for bad weather. He did not call to you with music. He threw your own courage back to you in a hard, white beam and asked you to see what the shoals were and steer accordingly. If some crashed despite him, that is the way of storms. If some lived because the beam existed, because someone had insisted upon the expense of stone and the tedium of maintenance and the endless watch, then the count comes out, if not even, then at least on the right side of ruin. When you wake, if you do, you will carry with you perhaps only this: the sense of a measured step upon a winter road, the hiss of an onion skin under a cook's knife in a castle starved to bone, the smell of tar and pitch and the black sleek backs of ships, the heavy, patient beauty of a wall that has learned to hold the long night, the silence of a man who does not pretend to be other than he is, and the strength of knowing that somewhere in the cold a ledger was kept honestly by someone who did not flinch. In every age the realm invents its brilliant comets and watches them burn and vanish. In every age it also needs a star that does not dazzle, the little stubborn one you set your course by because it does not lie. He was not the brightest of the three who watched their parents scatter into foam, but he was the one who faced the wind and did not ask the wind to change. If you listen closely you can hear the sea ending the way it began, with its ancient litany under the stones of Storm's End and the basalt shoulders of Dragonstone, as if reciting a prayer both unforgiving and true. It says that the realm will always require men who accept their portion without applause, men who keep their posts and their promises in the grip of weather that does not care for faces. It says that the middle of things, between glory and charm, may be where the long work is truly done. And it says, without warmth but not without comfort, that while some flames are made to delight, others simply burn to keep an old order from freezing, and that there is a dignity in such fire, quiet, persistent, illuminating enough for those who travel by it to remember their path home. In the years after he first set his jaw against the cold, there were nights when the sky above the Croftersville in the woods south of the bolted stronghold shivered with faint green fires that seemed more rumor than light, and the snow held the world steady as a hand holds a cup. In those nights a man who had left warmth behind 100 times walked the perimeters, counting not only what could be counted: arrows, bread, boots, breath, but the thin margins between courage and collapse. He would pause by the frozen pond where reeds leaned like old men listening, and he would taste the air as if it were a ledger he could read with his tongue, noticing when the moisture thickened in a way that meant the clouds would wring themselves out by morning, or when the wind had a bite in it that told of a front marching down from farther wastes. Snow has dialects, and he had learned them the way other men learn the flavors of wine. Inside, near the stink of damp wool and iron, men slept in lumps, and the horses steamed like loaves torn open. He old cook with a cracked voice turned oats into something that went down heavy enough to quiet the fiercest belly, and stale cheese softened enough over coals to remember it had once been milk. The king, who was a keeper dressed as a claimant, would drink something that ought to have been tea but was only spruce and resignation, then lay his fingers out on a rough board and close them slowly, reminding them what they were for. On his palm, across the callus under the thumb, a faint white line from childhood still spoke of a time when he had believed the world might be sweet enough to forget itself. He used to rub that scar with his other thumb when numbers did not balance, and in the rub lay a kind of prayer, if you want to call anything he did by that name. He wrote letters by dim lamps, and every letter was 2 letters, because words in winter must be read by enemies and friends alike. To the proud Lord Snug behind his crimson flayed banners, he wrote as a man writes to a man who trusts his cruelty more than his judgment, making his traps with nouns as clean as glass. To the old houses who remembered wolves, he wrote with the spare dignity of a man who had come from the sea to stand where the ground hurt. He did not flatter. He did not apologize for the smoke he dragged with him, the new rights he had permitted. He offered shelter with the blunt edges of a carpenter, measuring rooms with the same tape he used for spears and the space between tents. He proposed to make the north bearable. He did not pretend to make it easy. Of the men he had gathered, some stood in the cold as if the wind itself owed them respect, and some muttered into their beards the little prayers mountain folk make to streams and stone and the old names whose meanings have grown moss. He let them. He was not afraid of other men's altars so long as their oaths kept the same temperature as the air that cut his lungs. One cannot outlaw hope in a winter camp, he understood. One can only put it to work. He set the most hopeful men to mending, to patching the spots where canvas tired and where rope burned through from friction. He sent the most fearful to gathering saplings and birch bark, because fear loves to be busy. The lazy he did not abide. Laziness, he knew from siege, was a leak in the barrel you never found until the water ran away. The smuggler returned to him in such an hour with news, with the smell of fish offal still in his cloak and the old expression on his face that said he had done something difficult and expected to be punished for it and thanked in the same breath. There are friendships that do not use the word but fit it like a glove, and this was such a one. The smuggler spoke of ports and pastry-rich smiles, of a great lord whose belly was an argument about mercy, of oaths taken in rooms where sugar was more plentiful than courage. He laid before his king a path that went not through the front door but through the kitchen, which is often the better door for men who truly wish to be in a house. The king listened without nods and without that smile which people teach their children to expect from the powerful. He could not fashion his mouth into something it did not mean, but he put his hand, cold, dry, on the smuggler's wrist when the tale got to the part about losses that grow in the night like frost, and that was answer enough to keep the seaman bustling for a year. Beyond the camp line, where spruces locked crowns against the worst of the wind, a boy and a girl trudged toward him with winter on their mouths and the ache of escape in every muscle. The boy had been unloved by long habit and then hated by duty, which is a particular bitterness. The girl had been asked to play a part until the part hardened around her, and she was now shedding it with that careful ferocity known to trap things that have torn themselves loose at last. They came with a knight whose face had learned new rules and could not forget the old ones without cracking. Together they were a message the North meant to send in a language older than ravens. The king received them with the same measured severity he gave to victory and bad news alike, and in his eyes, as close to the fire as anyone ever got to them, there was the barest shine of something like pity. He ordered blankets and broth and did not speak their names more than necessary, because names sometimes pinch when you first return to them. The enemy's letters were polite, as letters are when written by men who have never needed to mend the same glove twice. They promised a dawn that would burn away rhyme and regret alike, and they lied, because their dawn was always bought with someone else's frostbite. The king answered with small courtesies and made his measures in the snow. He would not be hurried. He would not be lured. He would not be told that honor required a brilliance of gesture when what honor required was patience and a map of a frozen lake sketched from the mouths of men who had fished at boys and broken through once or twice and learned the feel of bad ice in the soles of their feet. That is one telling, and in it you can hear the creak of leather as a rider shifts in his saddle to listen to the lake. In another telling, the storm eats everything before numbers can be made to speak. In that story, fire becomes an answer to a question nobody should ask, and the question is asked anyway because men whose ledgers are too clean can begin to forget that humanity is the mess in the margins. In that version, the king's face, which had learned to hold disappointment the way the old stones hold lichen, cannot hold what must not be held, and something breaks that cannot be mended by any craft known to decency. The men around him begin to hear their own breathing in the night as accusation. When dawn comes in that tale, it does not cleanse. It reveals abandonment with the clarity only cold provides. The army dissolves not with screams but with a series of small scions made by boots and belts and backs that decide to turn away from the wind. It is a form of treason with no banner, and it empties a camp faster than fire. In such a version, the end is under a gray limb, a blade given by a tall woman who had once been taught honor by a man who could not keep it whole. The ledger shuts with a hush of frost, but let the other thread sing on, the one with the pond that keeps its secrets until the weight is just so. In that trail through the snow, the king takes the bait he set himself, and the proud lord comes riding in plate that looks handsome until the surface turns to black glass and then to teeth. In that frozen theater, banners plunge and crack. The lake accepts gifts of iron and hides them forever, and a cry goes up that will be remembered in kitchens more than in halls, because cooks tell of it when they stir pots at night. Afterward, the air smells of steel, of ice rot, of wet horse, of men sobbing in that private way that means their faces will never get back the shape they had before morning. Letters travel again, now from a holdfast where bread is baked with quiet sarcasm, and the fat lord whose sweetness hides a capacity for justice sends pies and men who have chosen their moment to shed fear. He sets a long table for the king and drowns an envoy in courtesies until the hall brims with laughter. Inside the laughter is a knife, and the king sees it, and by seeing it he knows that someone else in the world keeps a ledger, if not so neat as his. They understand one another without liking one another, and sometimes that is enough to ferry a winter to some thinner season. Dragonstone, far away, remembers its veteran. In the mornings the basalt dampness glistens like something alive, and gulls shred the horizon with their tired cries. In chambers where the old beasts look down in profiles taken from nightmares, a girl learns the shape of islands she may never see. She traces the river into the city with her finger and whispers the names of bridges as if names could be steps across fear. When she writes, her hand is careful, and her mother corrects her posture even as tears gleam in her eyes for reasons she will neither name nor examine. The Red Woman walks through that castle like a flame that has already chosen which logs it will love. Sometimes she stands near the girl and speaks kindly, because even fire has days when it wishes to be admired rather than used. The king, who has never been a man to borrow comfort, nevertheless borrows these moments by memory when the tents snap in a gust and the fire hisses because the wood is green. He sees in his mind the pale cheek with its old map of hurt and the set of a child's mouth when she is determined to do something that frightens her. He thinks of the cat and the letters and the way small hands lift a spoon with a ritual that suggests that certain simple acts are temples. In a world where victory is a cliff that crumbles even as you climb it, he steps down into that memory and warms his chilled fingers there for as long as duty will allow. Years peel back as easily as bark from a dead branch when thought is alone on a ridge of night. He sees again the day the ship went down off Storm's End, the hiss of rain scissoring the world into curtains. He can smell the exact brine, can hear the ugly, honest sound a hull makes when it gives. On the wall his brothers' faces blur and separate, and he watches himself choose not to weep. He feared, very early, that tears were a kind of leak, that once begun they would not stop unless a man nailed himself shut. He did not yet understand that there are other leaks and that some are worse. He holds the memory without condemning the boy he was. He thinks of the Castellan, a patient man with a voice like bread, who taught him that one can only judge the weather, not persuade it. The Castellan's lessons were simple. Don't eat the grain you will need when the month turns. Don't burn a chair for an hour's heat in winter. Don't order a man to stand in the rain unless you are willing to stand beside him. He visits in his mind the long angle of the castle keep at Dragonstone. the rain that runs down its face as if the stone were crying and not ashamed to be seen doing it. He remembers walking with his wife once along a parapet where the stones sweated out old salt. They had not spoken for most of the length of it. Silence with her often felt like a promise that someone would soon say something neither wished to hear. Yet on that day she had pointed at a far boat, a black sliver on rough water, and said simply that it was brave to be a boat on such a day. He had looked at her then, surprised by a remark so tender, and had loved her a little for it, and had said nothing, because his love always arrived as an absence of complaint and seemed poor coin against the lavish currency of other men's declarations. He knows now that his economy of affection was not always fair, but he also knows that it was true. Under the Red Woman's counsel, the island had learned to keep new fires, and old men had watched their grandsons' eyes brighten in a light that did not name their grandfather's god. He had allowed it to happen not only because he thought the world might be saved by it, but because he knew a thing most men pretend not to know. That faith is a kind of wind that fills any sail, and the point is to steer, not to shout at the gale for being what it is. He had asked the fire for proof and received instead patterns. Coincidences shaped to look like answers. Victories smudged by costs that made men stare into their cups. Yet in the midst of doubt, the Red Woman had looked at him with a knowledge that undressed his worries, and he had seen himself in her gaze as the man he hoped he might be if a few more counts balanced in his favor. Sometimes that is all a leader can ask of miracles, that they allow his men to see him the way he longs to see himself until he can grow into that cut of cloth. In the siege long ago he had eaten the same as his men and less. Hunger pinched his face until it learned the shape of the pinch and kept it. He held in his mouth the memories of onions and the soft heat of stew that had saved not just bellies but the idea that the next hour could be reached. He carved the smuggler his knighthood with the same knife he used to set fish on the table, because his justice was not theatrical. It was household, domestic, exact. He has sometimes been accused, even by those who liked him, of mistaking measure for meaning, and his answer was always the same. Whatever meaning you are chasing must be stored and transported in this world by some careful hand, or it will spoil. He believed that. He still did. Renly's bright camp returns to him sometimes in winter as an ache where his rib was once broken by a horse. The light on that green felt like a sin to eyes practiced in gray. He hears again the laughter that rose from soft-bellied lords who had never had to stand a watch alone. He hears, very faint, the last thing his brother said when they were boys and had crouched where the wind could not find them and shared the apple that had been meant for one. He cannot remember the words, only the cadence, and sometimes that seems like the worst kind of loss, the shape of affection without its language. He does not forgive because forgiveness is a craft he never had time to learn, but he does allow the memory to stand in the doorway without driving it out. He had thought once, when he could still be surprised by how much murmurs matter, that the realm might accept the arithmetic of his claim if only he explained it slowly enough, as if teaching boys to cast sums. But men do not love sums. They love stories, and his story had not been written with a pleasant pen. He had made his peace with that when the Green River boiled. The wildfire night still comes back in the manner of bad weather approaching on the smell of one's own coat. He remembers the crack of chain hidden under water. He remembers flame that seemed to need nothing to make its own air. He remembers that he did not panic, that he moved along the bank with a voice that made his men's eyes steady, and he remembers that the city did not fall, and that he did not either, and that one could survive a day that killed one's name. After the wall, when black brothers who had not slept properly in a month looked at him as if he were a chair that would not break under a heavy man, he felt an odd relief. To be necessary rather than adored is a comfortable fit to men made like him. He liked the boy John more than he liked most people, and that too was a relief because liking is a concession, and concessions properly spent make a man strong. He had tried very hard to give the boy a gift that would have bound them. The boy had thought of his own vows and refused, and in his refusal had given the king something else, respect that did not drip. He walked away from that conversation irritated and almost cheerful. When he took Deepwood Mott back for the Bear Women, he had ridden through pines so dense that the sound of the world seemed to recede into a brown hush. Snow fell in crumbs that day, not in sheets, and the air tasted of resin. The fight was quick and honest. None of the clever cruelties men devise when they have time. The old banners were raised, and an old woman said a sentence that will be told after we are gone, about how she knew no king but one. He did not smile when he heard it. He felt his spine stop aching for a moment, and it was better than smiling. To be a father in winter demands the same small constancies that keep tents taut in wind. He wrote to his daughter about weather as a way of talking about love. He told her whether the snow was dry like salt or wet like sugar. He told her whether the lake sang a deep wood note when the ice widened in a thaw, or whether it held its tongue in that exposing cold that makes even thoughts freeze at their edges. He told her of a fox that watched the camp with an academic skepticism. He told her of a man from the mountain clans who carved a wolf's head from pine and gave it to a boy who had lost his brother. He told her of the taste of lichen boiled and salted, and of the way men will tell jokes they do not think are funny because laughter is a rope thrown between drowners. He told her all this and did not write the other part, the part where a thing with antlers and a flayed hide haunted the edge of sight like a superstition you cannot quite laugh away. If his end came on a beach-ridged hill, he met it with the posture of a man who does not intend to waste anyone's time. He did not beg. He did not accuse the weather, or the gods, or the way certain families manage to own the smiles of the realm. He raised his chin and made the last act of counting a simple one. The breath he had was spent here and not elsewhere. And if his end did not come there, if he lived, thin and stubborn as a hedgerow in January, to see the river break and the ravens fly and the wolves gather in names, then he continued as he had begun, as a man who walks at the speed of duty when men around him want to canter after banners. There is a particular peace that comes from accepting one's speed. Years from those snows, when the realm put itself back together with the awkward grace of a bent knee rising, the story of him settled into a shape that children could follow without getting lost. It begins with the sea. It moves through walls and hunger, tallies and smoke, onions and sorrow. It passes by a glowing river, pauses at a black island that smells of wet stone and new fire. It climbs north until breath hurts, until a wall of blue-white stops the world, then drops into woods where strategies creak like trees under frost. It does not end at a throne. It ends, if it ends at all, in a room where a ledger is shut cleanly and a lamp is trimmed though nobody is awake to admire the steadiness. As of the flame, the smuggler grows old. His beard whitens like a dock rope left to sun. He still wakes some nights and feels the old ache where knuckles should be, and in that ache his king returns, stern as ever and oddly consoling. He walks down to harbors when storms are brewing, not because he can fix the weather but because he likes to see whether the boats are moored as they should be, whether the lowliest skiff has a fender out and a decent knot. He cannot bear to see a line coiled sloppily. It is his religion, the neat coil. People laugh at him gently, because he is beloved, as men who have done wrong and more good than wrong often are. He laughs with them and then fixes the rope when they are looking away. On the nights when his daughter can find sleep, the king we knew as severe appears as a long figure walking a beach where the sea seems to have been poured out and the stones shine like old coins at low tide. He walks as he always walked, with that forward intent that makes others step aside rather than offend him by meeting him. He bends once to pick something up and turns it in his hand and then puts it down again, not because it is worthless but because it belongs to the shore. He does not look up when gulls pass like complaints across the gray. He only keeps walking. His boots take on water and he does not slow, because wet is wet and there is no drier way to cross a certain stretch than to go through it and trust warmth later. At Dragonstone the servants who remember him move more quietly than others. Their hands are competent in the way that means no dropped plates, no fires left to sulk into smoke. They teach their apprentices that the correct way to beat a rug is as important as any prayer, because order is a kindness you extend to the world when the world cannot guarantee you mercy. In the long gallery, the statues of beasts watch a tide of years, and in their stone eyes you can sometimes imagine a flash of copper when the lamps are trimmed in the evening. It is only a trick of light, of course, but the mind likes to think the old sorceries pay attention when someone continues the work of keeping. The red woman's fire goes on whispering even when no one attends it, because fire is that way. There are nights when she sees in it what her heart aches to see, that the prince she named in a tongue older than kingdoms was not consumed but tempered, that he walks some necessary road in snow with the patience of a chiseler, and that sparks fly from his steps in ways that will be seen by those who come after. There are nights when the fire shows only itself, which is a hard lesson even for a priest, that sometimes flame is just flame and not a message. She accepts both nights with the posture of a servant who has learned to live with doubt. If she dreams of a beach and a bright sword and a marrow-deep grief, she keeps that dream tucked where prayer cannot heat it into smoke. She mutters names with the respect a butcher gives to good knives. The boy John, who once refused a warm title in favor of a cold oath, grows into a width of responsibility that would have crushed a softer back. In the work of keeping men from being fools, he thinks often of the king who asked him to be more than he was ready to be, and who did not hate him when he said no. He picks up that half-offered mantle in his own way, and somewhere in the doing of it he understands that sometimes the most generous gift a man can give is the chance to refuse him. He sends, when he can, a cart of apples to a place where an onion once came like a saint, and the men who taste the bright flesh grinning with juice on their chins do not know why their mood lifts into that peculiar combination of gratitude and stubbornness that once built a castle against the sea. The old storm keep watches the water with the patience of an anvil. It knows what it is for. The air there tastes of iron and gulls, and the flags run with weather like rivers run with rain. Sometimes a boy on those walls speaks of the three brothers who watched sails go under and who grew into different answers to the same question. He points in the direction of Dragonstone and in the direction of King's Landing and into the north that reaches up into the realm of breathless stories. And he is as earnest as youth always is when it first meets the idea that men can be made so differently by what hurts them. The old arms-master says nothing for a time, because silence is his hammer. Then he says that the trick is not to become kind or beloved or victorious, not at first. The trick is to become trustworthy, and that takes longer than a song. In little villages sunken into reeds, old men tell the tale with the slow delight of a weed cutter stropping his blade. They dwell on the part with the chain in the river because boys like to see things snap taut. They savor the onions for the way mouths listen when they are mentioned. They mention dragons not because they saw them, but because calling that island by its nature makes the world seem more orderly. They hush when the crofter's pond appears, because most of them have ponds nearby that change demeanor in winter, and they know how easily a misstep becomes a tragedy. They do not agree about the beach. Some stop the tale there and look into their cups. Some continue past it into a road that curves and keeps curving. The disagreement does not worry them. They understand that winter itself is a disagreement between sky and earth that must be endured every year. What all the tellings share is the slow, dry certainty of the man at their center. The teachers among them, those who have spent lifetimes convincing bored boys that lines must be held straight and that numbers sing if you hold your ear to them, love this part the best. They say that the king who was really a steward of hard times kept a promise to the idea of the realm. They say he did not expect the realm to love him back for it, and they say this is what distinguishes him from most men who grip power until the knuckles show. They say he is a good story to tell when the harvest has been thin and the wind threatens to take a door off its hinges. The fire, they say, will show you sometimes the face of a saint, and sometimes the shape of a man who doesn't blink, and both are worth watching. At sea, on gray mornings when fog leans its head against the mast and listens, sailors tighten lines as if that alone keeps the world together. One of them, always, wears an old carved onion pinned to his cap. He doesn't know why this helps him find the rhythm for hauling, but it does. He spits in his palm and counts without moving his lips the way he saw a lord do once long ago from a pier with black water under it. The count steadies him. When squalls throw their fists at the sailcloth, the ship answers, and the men grin with the wild joy that is half fear. The sea is never wholly mastered. It allows brief illusions, and then it reminds. The story of the man who would have been a king if the world cared more for truth than delight feels honest in the mouths of men the sea might take. In gardens far south where lemons yellow a winter no northerner would recognize, women rock children to sleep with a version of the tale that softens stones into decorum. They make of him a figure with clean hands and eyes like winter rivers. They tell of onions and walls and a boat in the night and of a sword that might have been a greater thing if the world had not needed a more modest tool. They polish his roughness until he is as smooth as a saint. The men listening in the doorway shake their heads and let them have it. Men and women both must sometimes make statues out of the people who saved them, or else they do not sleep. And in the great cities where laws are made and broken in the same room, scholars arch to reach dusty tomes and argue under their breath. They line their book spines like ranks on a field and set footnotes like caltrops. Their quarrels matter less than they hope. Still, they catch one truth and hold it long enough to name it: that in the shaping of an age, there must be at least one person who refuses to treat duty as a negotiable currency, because once that coin is shaved, the realm spends years discovering how to pay for anything at all. They call him by his name with fewer curses than their fathers did, and that is one way to measure the slow mercy of time. If he died beneath the beach, the leaves still whisper his name on certain nights when wind drifts through, and the soil carries a rumor of iron down and down until water lifts it into roots. If he lived beyond the lake's black mirror and the hard arithmetic of hunger, then he lives in the manner that men like him always live. He disappears into the work until the work is all that remains, and then one day a problem you did not know how to solve is solved because someone like him stood there at the right hour and would not move. Either way, when we think of winter holding fast, the image that steadies us is not of feasts or songs or crowns. It is of a lean man on a ridge counting quietly while the snow writes its pale alphabet across the land. A man who speaks seldom and then only to say what must be done and to name, without sputter or complaint, the price. The sea that began and ends him goes on, gray upon gray upon gray, sometimes showing the color of pewter, sometimes the color of a bruise, sometimes the secret green that belongs to spring low in its belly but that only old fishermen ever see. Storm's End stands with its shameless walls, as honest about its purpose as a tool that remembers the hand that made it. Dragonstone rises dripping and volcanic from a mind older than men, and night birds bang like questions against its cliffs. The wall, that impossible construction, throws a blue shade on its own story even when the world looks away. In these places, stone against water, fire against dark, ice against everything, the story of the middle brother belongs. He is not the tempest that brought down a dynasty, nor the breeze that made banners beautiful. He is the draft that keeps the room bearable when the door is shut and winter stalks around the house. He is the beam that does not split when the roof must take a load. And if you close your eyes in such a room, if the logs have fallen to red and the last cup has been set down with the quiet care of a man not wishing to wake an infant, you may hear a slow step going down a corridor. It is not a ghost. It is not a father with a song. It is the careful measure of a man who has always moved at the speed of what must be done, going to see that the lamp is trimmed, that the door is latched, that the ledger is put away safe from the damp. It is the sort of sound that makes no story at all and then, in the memory of those who sleep, becomes the story by which we make our way in bad weather, steady to the next morning and beyond, under a sky that has forgotten us and a sea that never will.